Kansas, 1883. Jonah Hale was 29 years old, and in all those years, he had never once slept under a roof that belonged to him. He had built other men's fences, mended other men's harness, broken other men's horses, and every October, he had watched other men's wheat go gold in fields he had planted with his own 2 hands and would never own an inch of. He worked for the Prescott outfit that year, same as the 3 before it, and he was good at his work, the kind of good that gets a man remembered fondly and paid exactly what he is owed and not a cent more. There is a particular ache in driving a nail into wood that will never be yours. Jonah knew it the way other men knew the weather. He had felt it in 100 barns and along 100 fence lines, and he had stopped expecting it to go away. He was standing on the courthouse steps in the town of Averill when he first heard about the Larkspur claim. The county held its tax auction twice a year, and most of what came up for bid was land nobody wanted. A man from the assessor's office read the parcels off a list in a flat voice, and the crowd thinned with every name until only the auctioneer, a clerk, and a handful of men, too curious or too broke to leave, were left standing in the cold. Parcel 41, the assessor's man said. The old Larkspur place, Northwest Quarter Section, Section 9, soddy and a root cellar, both said to be in poor repair. Taxes owed for 4 years running. Opening bid, $9. Nobody moved. The Larkspur place, a man near Jonah muttered to his neighbor, low enough that he probably thought Jonah couldn't hear. Nobody's touched that ground since the family left it. Say the well went bad. Say worse things too, if you ask the wrong folks. $9, the assessor's man said again, scanning the thinned-out crowd. Do I hear $9 for the Larkspur claim? Jonah had $11 folded in his coat pocket, money he had been saving toward a horse of his own, and he had never in his life owned a piece of ground bigger than the floor of a rented room. He thought about the nail and the wood that was never his, and before he had fully decided to do it, his hand was already up. $9, he said. Nobody bid against him. The gavel came down light and quick, like the county was glad to be rid of the place. And just like that, for the price of a used saddle, Jonah Hale owned 160 acres of Kansas ground with a broken-down soddy and a root cellar and a reputation nobody in Averill seemed eager to explain out loud. He rode out to see it the next morning, before he had even told the Prescotts he was leaving their employ. The soddy sat low against the horizon, its sod roof caved in on one corner, its single window shuttered and swollen with old rain. Dead sunflowers stood in a ragged line along what had once been a garden path. The well the man had mentioned sat capped with a warped board, and Jonah didn't test it that first day. He walked the fence line instead, what was left of it, and felt something in his chest loosen just slightly, the way a knot loosens when you finally stop pulling on it. It was his. Whatever else it was, whatever the well tasted like, whatever had happened to the Larkspur family that made grown men lower their voices, it was his. I want to stop here for just a moment. This story has found listeners in Brazil, in Nigeria, in India, in the Philippines, in Mexico, in South Africa, in places I never imagined a story about one broken-down Kansas claim would ever travel. And if you're one of them, watching tonight, hearing this for the first time, this channel is still young. We're just getting started. If a story like this one finds a place in your heart, hit subscribe before you go anywhere. It helps more than you know, and it means we get to keep bringing you nights like this one. Now let's get back, because Jonah was about to learn exactly why nobody else in Averill had wanted that land. The Kansas of 1883 was not a kind place to be poor. The land boom that had pulled thousands of families west in the years after the war had already begun to sour in the drier counties, where rainfall never quite matched what the railroad pamphlets had promised. Homestead claims went delinquent by the dozen. County tax rolls filled with names of families who had simply packed a wagon in the night and gone back east, leaving the ground and the debt behind them. It was common enough in a county like this for a claim to change hands 3 or 4 times before anyone managed to make it pay, and common enough, too, for the stories about why a place had failed to grow taller with every retelling. Jonah didn't put much stock in ghost talk. He put stock in roofs and wells and fence posts, and the Larkspur place needed all three. He spent his first week patching the soddy roof with fresh sod cut from the creek bank, and his second week clearing brush from the old garden path, and it was on the 9th day, hauling a load of split cedar toward the root cellar to store it dry, that he heard something move behind the warped door. He set the wood down slow. The root cellar was dug into the rise behind the soddy, its door a heavy slab of grayed wood half sunk into the earth, the kind of door built to keep a Kansas winter out, and whatever a family had put up for that winter safe inside. Jonah had opened it once already, on his first day, and found nothing but empty shelves and the smell of old dirt. He was certain of that. He had looked. The sound came again, not wind, not a rat. Something closer to breath. "Whoever's in there," Jonah said, standing well back from the door. "I own this ground now, paid for legal at the courthouse in Averill, and I mean you no harm, but I'd be obliged if you'd tell me who you are before I open that door again." For a long moment, there was nothing. Then a voice answered, quiet and rough with disuse, unmistakably a woman's. "If I tell you," she said, "will you send me back?" "Depends where back is," Jonah said. "But I've never sent anybody anywhere in my life, and I don't plan to start with someone hiding scared in a root cellar." The door creaked open from the inside, slow, and a woman stepped out into the gray daylight, blinking against it like she hadn't seen the sun in longer than made sense. She was perhaps 25, dressed in a traveling dress gone gray with dust, her dark hair escaping its pins in every direction, her hands raw at the knuckles in a way that told Jonah she'd been doing some kind of hard work with them recently, and not the kind a lady's dress was built for. "My name is Mercy Doyle," she said, "and I'll be gone from your land within the hour if you'll only let me gather my things." "Nobody's asking you to be gone," Jonah said. "I'm asking why a woman's living in my root cellar." Mercy looked at him for a long moment, weighing something, and then she looked away, out toward the flat gold horizon, and told him. Her father had died owing money to a man named Silas Corwin, a grain merchant and moneylender out of Ellis County, who had a particular talent for making sure debts followed a family long after the debtor himself was in the ground. Corwin had come to the Doyle farm within a week of the funeral holding papers that Mercy's father had signed years before, papers that bound his labor, and failing that, his daughters, to Corwin's household until the debt was satisfied in full. 3 years, Mercy said. That's what the paper says. 3 years of my labor in his house, cooking, cleaning, whatever he asks of me, and at the end of it, the debt's called even. I was there 4 months before I understood what kind of man he was, and what he actually meant by satisfied. She didn't say more than that, and Jonah didn't ask her to. He had grown up around enough hard men to fill in the shape of it himself, the way a debt like that could be twisted into something closer to ownership than employment, the way a paper signed by a dying man in a moment of desperation could be used like a leash on the daughter he left behind. Later, once the weeks had turned to months and trust had grown up between them, the slow, unhurried way real trust does, Mercy told him the rest of it, the part she hadn't been ready to say to a stranger on the day she stepped out of a root cellar into daylight. Her father had been a decent man most of his life, a small grain farmer in Ellis County who had borrowed against a bad harvest the way half the county had in those years, never meaning for the debt to become what it became. Corwin's terms had looked reasonable enough on paper, low enough interest to seem almost generous, and by the time her father understood what the fine print actually allowed, the harvest had failed a second year running, and there was no way left to pay the principal down before it compounded past reach. He didn't sign it to trap me, Mercy said. He signed it thinking he'd have it paid off in 2 seasons, same as any other loan. He died still believing that. It was only after the funeral that Corwin's lawyer explained what happened to a debt like that if the man who owed it wasn't there anymore to keep paying against it himself. Your father's grief becomes somebody else's profit, Jonah said. I've seen that trick before. just never dressed up so neatly in a lawyer's coat. It's a common enough trick in Ellis County, Mercy said. Common enough that most folks there just call it business and don't ask any further questions about it. That was the evening Jonah started keeping the shotgun loaded by the door, though he didn't tell her that was why. I ran 3 weeks ago, Mercy said. Walked most nights, slept days in whatever barn or dugout I could find that looked abandoned. This one looked more abandoned than most. It was, Jonah said. $9 worth of abandoned. That earned him the smallest flicker of something that wasn't quite a smile, but wanted to be. This is the third story on this channel. If you like stories like this one, subscribe and leave a like. It helps the channel grow more than you'd think. Leave me a comment and tell me, what are you doing right now while you listen? Are you driving, cooking supper, lying in bed at the end of a long day? I like knowing these stories travel to every corner of the world while you're doing all kinds of ordinary things. Now let's get back, because Jonah had a decision to make, and Mercy Doyle was watching him make it. You can't stay in a root cellar, Jonah said finally. It's not fit for a person, and it's for certain not fit through a Kansas winter. There's a second room in the soddy small, but it's got its own door, and I've got no use for it myself. You'd have to work, same as I do. There's no charity in a claim like this one. Everything on it earns its keep or it doesn't eat. But nobody's chasing you off my land, and nobody's dragging you back to Silas Corwin while I'm standing on it. Mercy studied him with the particular caution of someone who had learned, recently and painfully, exactly how much a man's kindness could cost. Why would you do that? She said. For a stranger you found hiding in your cellar? Because I spent 9 years working ground that was never going to be mine, Jonah said. And I know what it does to a person, being owned by somebody else's paper. Whatever this place turns out to be, it's mine free and clear, and I aim to keep it that way for both of us, if you'll have it. She stayed. The two of them worked the claim through that spring like partners, rather than employer and employed, though neither of them said the word out loud. Mercy turned out to have a gift with animals that Jonah lacked entirely, gentling a half-wild milk cow he'd traded a week's labor for, coaxing a garden out of soil that had gone hard and cracked from 4 years of neglect. Jonah rebuilt the soddy roof properly, dug the well clean, and found, buried under 4 years of dust in the root cellar shelves, a cache of preserved jars the Larkspur family had left behind. Peaches and beans gone dark with age, but the glass unbroken, a small inheritance from strangers neither of them would ever meet. The drought that summer was the worst Averill County had seen since the family Jonah bought the claim from had packed up and left it behind. Wells across the county ran shallow or ran dry outright, and more than one neighbor came asking after the Larkspur well, the one everyone had assumed was ruined, and found instead that Jonah had cleared it and it ran sweeter and deeper than half the wells in the township. He didn't charge for the water. He didn't have it in him to charge a neighbor for water in a dry year, not after 9 years of knowing what it felt like to need something you couldn't afford. Mercy noticed that about him before he noticed it about himself. You give away more than a man with $9 ought to give away, she told him one evening, watching him fill a neighbor's barrels for the 3rd time that week. I had less than $9 most of my life, Jonah said. Never once stopped me wanting to help a person who had less than that. It was the kind of exchange that meant more than either of them said out loud. Neither of them spoke of Silas Corwin much through those months, though Jonah noticed the way Mercy went quiet and still whenever a wagon came up the road unannounced, the way her eyes went to the door before her hands finished whatever task they were on. He noticed, and he said nothing, and he made sure the shotgun by the door was always loaded, not because he meant to use it on a man, but because a scared woman deserved to see it there. The neighbors took longer to warm to the arrangement than the crops did. A woman living unmarried on a bachelor's claim was the kind of fact that traveled faster through Averill County than any drought or grasshopper plague. And for a while, Jonah caught sideways looks at the feed store, heard his name drop out of conversations a beat too quickly when he walked into the church social. Mercy heard worse, secondhand, from women who wouldn't say it to her face, but had no trouble saying it to each other within earshot of the wash line. "Let them talk," Mercy said one evening, when Jonah came home from town, looking like he'd swallowed something bitter on her behalf. "I've been owned by a signature before. I'd rather be talked about than owned." It was the widow Elsbeth Farrow who broke the ice first, riding out in September with a jar of chokecherry preserves and a reason she'd half invented about needing to borrow a harrow, and staying 2 hours past when the borrowing was done, because Mercy had a way of listening that made a lonely old woman feel heard for the first time in years. After that, the visits came steadier and the whispering thinned, the way whispering usually does once people run out of anything true to feed it. The drought settled in for good that August, the kind that cracked the county's clay soil into plates a man could lift whole from the ground. Creek beds that had run since before the war showed their gray stone bottoms for the first time anyone could remember, and the Averill paper ran a notice asking families with working wells to consider the needs of their neighbors before the fall harvest came due. Jonah didn't need the notice to tell him what to do. He'd hauled water for other men's stock for 9 years before he ever owned a bucket of his own, and he wasn't about to start hoarding water the 1 year he finally had some to spare. Wagons came up the Larkspur Road most mornings that month, farmers and their wives filling barrels from the well Jonah had cleared with his own hands, and more than one of them stood a while afterward just to see Mercy work the garden she'd coaxed whole out of cracked ground everyone else had given up on. She traded them seed and advice as freely as Jonah traded water, and by the time September came around, the Larkspur claim had become something neither of them had quite planned on, a place the whole township had a stake in seeing survive. "They needed us to be worth something before they'd forgive us for being unmarried under one roof," Mercy said, watching another wagon roll off down the dusty road with its barrels full. "Strange, the things people can forgive once you've been useful to them." "Strange," Jonah agreed, "but I'll take useful overjudged most days." He thought of Silas Corwin often that dry summer, more than he let on to Mercy, wondering when, rather than whether the man would come looking for the debt he considered still outstanding. He kept the well maintained and the shotgun loaded and the fence line walked at dusk. And when October finally brought a good buggy up the Larkspur Road instead of another farmer's wagon, some part of him had been waiting for it since spring. He came in a good buggy with a hired driver and a lawyer from Ellis County riding alongside him, a thin, careful man who did the talking so Corwin wouldn't have to dirty his own hands with it. Jonah was splitting wood when the buggy came up the road, and he set the axe down slow, the same way he'd set the cedar wood down slow outside the root cellar door 5 months before. "Mr. Hale," the lawyer said, once introductions had been made and refused in equal measure, "we understand you've been harboring a woman named Mercy Doyle, who is bound by a legally executed contract to labor in the household of my client, Mr. Corwin, until a debt of her late father's is satisfied. We're here to collect what's owed to him." "She's not a debt," Jonah said. "She's a person." "She's the collateral her father signed against," the lawyer said, unbothered. "And the contract is a matter of record in the Ellis County Courthouse. I'd advise you not to interfere with the lawful collection of a debt, Mr. Hale, whatever your personal feelings on the arrangement." Mercy had come out onto the step by then, pale but standing straight, and Corwin looked at her the way a man looks at a piece of furniture he'd misplaced and was mildly annoyed to have gone looking for. "3 years, girl," Corwin said. "You've cost me 4 extra months of interest with this little adventure. We'll call it 3 years and 4 months even, and we'll say no more about it." "I'd sooner die in a Kansas winter with no roof at all," Mercy said, "than spend 1 more day under your roof, Mr. Corwin." "That's not really the arrangement your father made," Corwin said, mild as milk, the mildness of a man who had never once had to raise his voice to get what he wanted. Jonah stepped between them, not with his fists, though every part of him wanted to, but with words, because he had learned enough in one dry summer of watching Mercy flinch at wagon wheels to know that violence would only hand Corwin exactly the excuse he needed. "I'd like to see that contract," Jonah said. "The actual paper, not your account of it." The lawyer produced it, smug and certain, and Jonah read it slow, twice through, while Corwin's driver shifted impatiently on the buggy seat, and Mercy stood very still on the step behind him. "This paper binds a daughter's labor against her father's debt," Jonah said finally, "with no ceiling on what tasks can be demanded of her, no witness signature beyond your own clerk, and a term that extends automatically for any expense Mr. Corwin declares related to her upkeep, decided solely by Mr. Corwin himself. I've hired enough hands and signed enough labor agreements in 9 years, working other men's land to know what an honest contract reads like. This isn't one. This is a paper built to never end." "That's a matter for a judge to decide," the lawyer said, less smug now. "Then let's ask him," Jonah said. "There's a circuit judge riding through Avril this very week for the fall docket. I'll ride in this afternoon and put the question to him directly, in front of witnesses, whether a contract with no fixed labor and no independent witness can bind a living woman like a piece of property. If the judge sides with you, Mr. Corwin, I'll not stand in your way." "But I don't believe he will, and I don't believe you believe it either, or you'd have brought the sheriff with you instead of a lawyer." Corwin's face did something complicated, calculation moving behind mild eyes, and Jonah understood in that moment that the man had never expected the contract to be tested in daylight, in front of a judge, with witnesses who weren't beholden to him. Papers like that worked because nobody ever read them closely, because desperate families signed them in grief and never thought to question the fine print, because a woman alone had no standing to challenge a lender's clerk-written terms. They did not work well in the open. "I've no need to waste a judge's time over a runaway girl," Corwin said at last, gathering his coat around him with the particular dignity of a man retreating while pretending not to. "Keep her if you're fool enough to want her. The debt was never worth the trouble it's cost me." The buggy turned around in Jonah's yard and rolled back down the road the way it had come, and Corwin never returned to Avril County again, not that either of them ever heard. Word of the standoff traveled through Avril faster than the drought news had, and this time the whispering ran a different direction entirely. Elsbeth Farrow rode out within the week to hear the story firsthand, and by the following Sunday, half the church social already had the details, some of them more colorful than what had actually happened, though none of them unkind. A circuit-riding lawyer himself, passing through town on other business, later told Jonah over coffee at the feed store that he ought to have been a barrister instead of a farmer, that reading a bad contract back to the man who'd written it, in front of witnesses, was as fine a piece of legal instinct as he'd seen from a man with no formal training in it at all. "I didn't do it for the compliment," Jonah told him. "I did it because I've read enough labor agreements in 9 years of hired work to know one built to trap a person from one that just pays them fair." The lawyer allowed that this was, in fact, the whole art of the profession, and bought Jonah's coffee that morning as thanks for putting it so plainly. Mercy sat down hard on the step once the dust of the buggy wheels had settled, her hands shaking now that there was finally room to let them. "You didn't know the judge would side with us," she said. "You didn't know at all." "No," Jonah admitted. "But I knew a man like Corwin doesn't want daylight anywhere near his paperwork. I bet on that instead of the judge. That's a hard thing to bet a person's whole life on. I had 9 years of nothing to lose before this claim," Jonah said. "I know how to bet on hard things." Winter came on hard that year, the kind of Kansas winter that tested every roof and every well in the county, and the larkspur soddy held, warm and dry, and finally, fully theirs. It was sometime in February, with the wind howling flat across the plains outside and the fire burning low in the hearth, that Mercy told Jonah she had decided something. "I've been thinking on the word partner," she said. "You've never once called me a hired hand, not since the day I came out of that cellar, though by every right of law, that's all I was to you for months. I'd like to make that word mean something more binding than a debt paper ever did, if you're willing." Jonah didn't answer with words at first. He crossed the small room and took her raw, work-worn hands in his, the hands that had gentled a wild cow and coaxed a garden out of cracked earth and shaken loose from a buggy's dust. and he held them the way a man holds something he has, finally, after 9 years, been given the right to call his own. They were married that spring in the small church at Averill by a preacher who had heard the whole story secondhand by then and told it kindly. And the Larkspur claim stopped being a place people lowered their voices about and started being a place people mentioned with something closer to admiration: the well that never ran dry, the garden that came back from nothing, the couple who had turned $9 of tax-auctioned ground into the most reliable water in the township. The Larkspur claim changed slowly after that, the way real prosperity always seems to arrive slower than a person expects, and then, looking back, all at once. The well that never ran dry became known clear across the township, and Jonah found himself, within a few years, less a hired hand's memory of a man, and more the fellow other farmers rode out to ask advice from when their own ground gave them trouble. Mercy's garden grew into something the Averill paper wrote up one autumn, a full column about the woman who had turned cracked, abandoned soil into the best kitchen garden in the county, and neither of them ever corrected the parts of the story the paper got wrong, the parts that left out root cellars and debt papers and buggies full of lawyers. Because some things a person earns the right to keep private, even after they've become a little bit famous for the rest of it. They had 2 sons in those years, and buried 1 daughter too young, a grief that never entirely left either of them, but that they carried the way the whole county carried its hard winters, together and without pretending it hadn't happened. The soddy became a proper frame house by 1890. Built plank by plank from lumber Jonah could finally afford to buy outright, though he insisted on keeping the old root cellar exactly where it stood, repaired but never replaced. Its door rehung true on new hinges the same week the frame house went up around it. 12 years later, in the spring of 1895, a young girl who had grown up hearing the story from her own mother stood at the mouth of the old root cellar, now repainted. Its door hung true and sturdy, and asked why her mother always paused a moment before opening it, every single time, even after all these years. "Because this door is where your father found me," Mercy told her, "hiding from a life I never chose, and it's the same door I walked through into a life I did choose, right after. A person doesn't forget a door like that. You don't rush past it. You let it remind you, every time, of what you walked out of and what you walked into instead." The girl considered that, the way children consider things that are almost too large for them yet, and went back to helping her father stack the split cedar he still cut every autumn, out of habit as much as need. The same wood he had been carrying the day he first heard something breathe behind a warped and sunken door. I have thought a great deal, writing this one, about the difference between a paper that owns a person and a door that only ever offered her a choice. Kansas in those years was full of both kinds, contracts written to trap the desperate, and doors, however unlikely, that opened instead of closing. Jonah Hale never once believed $9 could buy him more than 160 acres of hard, uncertain ground. He never guessed it would also buy him the chance to be the kind of man his own hard years had taught him to become, the kind who opens a door instead of asking what's owed for it. If there's a door like that in your own life tonight, whatever shape it takes, I hope you have the nerve to walk through it. Until the next story, take care of each other.